Now, focusing on individual intellectual or biographical trajectory is surely important to understand the intellectual network between German and local tradition in Southeast Europe or in the Balkans. However, unlike Milton, I would focus, I considered of utmost importance in the area of Albanian studies as elsewhere to assess the critical handling of ethnographic historical sources and contribution produced within certain methodological and theoretical framework involving German-speaking intellectual influence. And I mean by that mostly the Volkskunde tradition or the Volkskunde paradigm. And I would like to present my case as an illustration of what I say this morning, that there is no, unlike Sebastian, there is no universal knowledge, but all knowledge is produced in a contextualized way. It is valid for one time, one space, and for some purpose. Now, a group of German-speaking writers, which were mostly Austrian, Hungarian, but also Prussian scholars with a strong interest in Albania and its history, belong to the founding generation of Albanian studies. Many dealt with archaic features of Albanian society, especially concerning customary behavior and the so-called tribal organization, but also with Albanian ethnogenesis, which included the question of Illyrian heritage and the extent and result of successive processes of Hellenization, Romanization, Slavicization, but also Christianization and Islamicization of the present-day Albanian-speaking areas. It is possible that many of their observations turned out to be wrong or misleading on further research, but their contribution still provides, I would say, a short expedient for further studies by native scholars in Albania. However, a main problem with many of these writers is that they consciously or perhaps unconsciously promoted the idea that at the beginning of the 20th century, the unknown Albania and the Albanians were still at the stage of the last undiscovered region in the Balkan, so close and yet so far on the southeastern margin of Europe. So, orientalizing and Balkanizing images singled out certain seemingly archaic phenomena which were labeled and reified as Albanian. They put emphasis on the so-called Albanian tribe and their primitive laws, archaic blood revenge, and the primitiveness or the purity of the indigenous people. All this boosted an intellectual movement among native scholars, which culminated in a stylized text of customary law, published by the Albanian Franciscan of Shkodra in 1933, who had a clear social and political agenda, which was not to record the law, but to improve it, working toward an enlightened revitalization of their own nation. Their overarching goal, and barely discussed objective, was to provide Albanians with a national identity to strengthen and unify their new nation. Now, the image of the Albanians at the beginning of the 20th century was frozen until the end of the century, when the country opened again to foreign travelers, who continued to flock to Albanian highland in search of what they imagined, again, to be the distilled essence of the mountain spirit, a barbarous and splendid anachronism embodied in a primitive and fearless mountain people living according to an ancient code of honor enforced by tribal law still on the margin of modern Europe. This kind of literature, as a pure construction and an act of ethnocentrism, created a certain stereotype, not only of a land of the living past, as Edith Durham once called Albania, but also a mixture of exoticism and Balkanism, partaking in the logic of many nesting Orientalism. Lévi-Strauss, in his Tristropique, bitterly deplored similar stances in anthropology. To borrow his term, this literature would represent another instance of the same mistake of a whole profession to believe that men are not always men, that some are more deserving of interest and attention, only because in the midst of Europe they seem to astonish us by the strangeness of their customs. In Albania, there was no equivalent to social anthropology before or during the socialist period, and this is still not the case. The field has been dominated by what corresponds to folklore studies and were focused on one's own national culture, the culture of the nation to which the researcher belonged. They celebrated a national model that is supposed to be deeply rooted in the past, uncovering an older and unsullied state of folk culture and folk spirit, or Volksgeist. Their methodology is based on folkloric data collection in the manner of the German Volkskunde, which can be traced back to Herder's perspective on culture and other German romantic reaction to universalism underpinning French Enlightenment. As such, the field of folkloric studies in Albania can be viewed as a rework of the German Kulturhistorische Schule. This culturalist and historicist tradition has been institutionalized as a deliberate, organized, conscious effort to construct a more satisfying culture by what is known now as a revitalization movement, or better, as Rilindia Contare, the Albanian term for the awakening of the nation. This shows especially, again, in the way how these studies deal with customary law. A second edition of Djećov text is also published by the official academic presses of the communist era, which is highly critical of the Franciscan compilation, but still shows the vaunted identity and unity of the Albanian society and culture, something which was actively promoted by both Catholics and communists alike. In this text, a metaphor for nation revitalization was rediscovered, independent of historical teleology and religious differentiation. The notion of blood kinship relation, which was the basis of the blood laws, and could at the same time be used to express national connectivity through blood. The law was therefore meant to regulate what reproduces the most fundamental structure of society and its greatly specific and authentic cultural identity throughout the world. The fact that these studies are oriented toward one's own culture and cultural details, toward the search of authenticity or antiquity of customs and cultural value of a given society, which is one's own society, bears in itself important political, social, ideological, and cultural implications. The methodological framework is necessarily a kind of folklorism in the sense of German Volkskunde tradition, which deliberately or inadvertently becomes prey of and at once fuel political ideologies stemming from nationalistic claim or totalitarian regimes. These studies took shape in the historically determined condition when the national state were created across Central and Eastern Europe as movement of national liberation from Ottoman, Russian, Prussian or Habsburg overlords. This condition created a burning feeling of national resentment and a climate of extremely favorable to the production or adoption of all-encompassing ideological solution, which led the local intellectual elite to consider romantic nationalism a viable strategy for overcoming the historical problem they were faced with. As a nationalist ideology, Romanticism started with German national resentment giving birth to pan-Germanism. Paradoxically, the threat stemming from German reaction induced similar resentment giving birth to pan-Slavism. Other national elites reacted not only to pan-Germanism but also to pan-Slavism, giving birth to Neo-Hellenism, and finally, in the context of Ottomanism, to Albanianism. Thus, a chain reaction of mutually imposed national frustration and reactive exaltation were the driving force of Romanticism, which must have sparked off in Balkan imaginary communities from 19th century proto-nationalism to modern ethno-nationalism. The reception of Romanticism turned these studies into a weapon of politics and national pride, which brought about the interest in collection, description, preservation, and often exaltation of one's own national folk culture, altogether with the scientific ideal of nation-building discipline. As such, they are clearly caught up in celebration of the nation, and question of language, philology, folklore, customs, and tradition have always provided the core argument of the great debate on modernity in Albania. As elsewhere, folklore and the discourse on folk culture and folk way of life have contributed to the essentialization of the national character, providing argument to nationalism. In addition, the communist holder of the new totalitarian power skillfully used such a kind of research in legitimizing their own program. Since the beginning, Albanian studies have developed by emulating and replicating the theory of methods of German Volkskunde. But when the latter was obliged after 1945 to break with its own tradition, Albanian studies remained preoccupied with Albanian national character and approached folk culture still in essentialist terms. During the early decades of socialism, the Volkskunde tradition had another, seemingly quite different tradition grafted up onto it. Under the label of ethnography, folk culture studies in Albania emulated Soviet ethnographia as in other East European countries. By the end of the 50s, contact with Soviet scholars were inexistent in Albania, and the only joint research project with colleagues from another brother country was one in collaboration with East German scholar from Humboldt University investigating folk music in Albania. Whether the Soviet ethnographia tradition was grafted upon the German Volkskunde tradition in Albania under the direct influence of East German scholar is open to discussion. I have some other hints about that, but what is more important to argue here is that German Volkskunde tradition and Soviet ethnographia tradition can arguably considered both of the same kind, being intimately interlinked, both historically and homologically. Clearly, the way how in Germany the discipline was distorted and mobilized for reactionary political ends have long been recognized and articulated. But there are some incisive analyses to show how Volkskunde was deliberately relaunched after 1945 in the East German zone of Soviet administration to become later the German Democratic Republic. In any case, in Albania, as elsewhere, the ethnography studies conceived culture as a core characteristic of a deliberately ethnicist concept of folk, called ethnocultura, which merged into that of people and nation, cultura popolare contare, paralleling the concept of ethnos or ethnos in Soviet ethnographia. While the category of people or folk in cultura popolare slipped easily into a political equation of people with nation, it was increasingly associated with an additional socio-class understanding of the people in contemporary socialist society, leading to the socialist nation, and paralleling the development of the concept of people in East German Volkskunde, where a specific socio-class category of demos was distinguished from ethnos as a more general ethnocultural category. Researchers continue to deal with the distinct cultural feature of the people and their ethnic and national specialities, within a retrospective passing from the present to the ancient past, building backward all historical processes of the folk culture development. But they must also adopt a broader perspective toward the study of socialist transformation and the new way of life for the new culture to be national in form and socialist in content. By the late 60s, the intensification of class struggle against reactionary and antiquated customs assigned new tasks to Albanian studies. To quote one of the older representatives, urged to discover the historical root and fight the reactionary philosophical foundation of corrupt customs that were holding back the development of society, they consciously focused their effort in replacing them with new customs by directly contributing to the solution of the major duties set forth by the Communist Party toward the further development and intensification of the ideological and cultural revolution in the country. Social practices and cultural value that were not compatible with communist ideology were now treated as inauthentic or alien or disruptive to Albanian socialist reality and were to be removed from the realm of folk culture. Set apart as backward custom, they actually conflicted communist morality by mirroring class interest of the worldview of the people living in darkness and so on. So they were deemed to be due to foreign importation or originate from socio-economic factor, nothing to do bourgeois socio-economic factor or bourgeois classes. In this way, these studies were expected to contribute to an extremely important process of aesthetic or rational cultural cleansing in the struggle against reactionary and evil vestiges of the past. Recognition and accentuation of the fact that a common culture, national in form and socialist in content, could be shared by the people as a working class within Albanian society was an important consequence of Lenin's theory of two exclusively differentiated culture in class societies, which was better elaborated in the demos concept of East German Volkskunde. While in East Germany, such a refinement compared to the more general ethno-cultural category of ethnos might also have been useful to avoid the thorny question of East German nation in the context of divided Germany. In Albania, as elsewhere in Eastern Europe, the exclusionist communist project and propaganda did much to transform cultural and historical tradition into instrument for justifying and magnifying the original, the authentic, the immutable people's foundation of the political and ideological regime. As such, the exclusionist socio-class understanding of the people in Albania paralleled other types of political folklorist and pseudo-culturalist project where specific ethno-religious and ethno-racial categories of the people were used in support of both chauvinistically or ideologically charged nationalists and fascists. For instance, the ethno-religious ideology underlying the political instrumentality of the Serbian mythology of the Battle of Kosovo in support of the chauvinistic Serbian nationalism from the 19th century to the last war over Kosovo in the 90s. And above all, the ethno-racial category of the people underlying the project of German Volkskunde in support of Hitler's propaganda campaign to promote the sinisterly notorious ethno-racist Nazi ideology. Actually, in Albania, as elsewhere, folkloric studies have surrendered their academic ethnos and integrity, their theories and methodology, their institution, and most of their representative to the authoritarian and paternalistic intention and policies of a totalitarian state ruled by a communist party. Scholarly narrative on customary laws and other tradition were manipulated to justify the formulation of state policies in the ideological struggle against backward customs and the adoption of certain political solutions, leading in many cases to cultural, social, and economic disaster. Arguably, even few indirectly, they must have mattered in an extreme, sometimes devastating way for many people, giving legitimacy and laying the theoretical foundation to policies of class repressions, expulsion, and resettlement of backward and therefore alien people. Actually, data from the systematic investigation of all tradition and backward customs were used, this is a quote from the director of the research institute, were used by party committees and organizations to improve the value and impact of the ideological and organizational work of the party because they provide a more solid basis to improve analysis and synthesis in the ideological party work with people, and they definitely help party workers to better know the people and more easily convey the party line to them. End of the quote. In this way, more than anything else, these studies seem to have provided theoretical foundation to the communist policy of hegemonic control over the whole population. As such, these studies during socialism in Albania and elsewhere, like their counterparts in German Volkskunde, must be unhesitatingly indicted as nationalist and communist apologists for official policies. Unequivocally, based on their conservative national and political objectives, they were highly disposed, if not even predestined, to be used and misused under communist rule as a national science of systematically stabilizing state control. Now, if the reason why Albania seems simply not ready for an engagement with nationalist ideology and its communist social class variation must be examined at another time, it seems that Europäische Ethnologie, which has this plus, Volkskunde ethnography at Humboldt University in Berlin derives to a large extent from long-established trends in Volkskunde and the disciplinary vision developed during the socialist era. In any case, for one thing that I am sure, more serious problems of political and ideological implication often show many contemporary Western studies. Part of the problem may be a regrettable methodological bias in the tendency of some Western scholars who continue to exclusively consider outmoded statistics and snapshot factual cataloging as primary sources of academic interpretation, a tendency which is also characteristic, especially to native Albanian studies. A case in point is the apparently important part that religion is supposed to play in Albanian cultural logic, which anachronistically targets an already outmoded rhetoric of communist nationalist or religious propaganda on the essentially tolerant and progressive character of certain religious group within a purported multi-religious and syncretistic Albania. What seems to escape to most Western scholars are the complex mechanisms that make it possible for social value, religious belief, and political ideologies to meet together in relation to the structure of a society as a whole. Actually, Albanian religious history has been more instrumental in ethnopolitics than anything else, while the nature of one religious group called Bektashism, for example, among other religious groups, can be seized more intelligibly as a mystical and heterodox order within Islam throughout its historical development by considering the political instrumentality of the religious structure within an ideological cultural system. In addition, it seems that many contemporary German-speaking scholars are now taking a new lead in a joint effort to repair what they believe are the culturalist mistakes of previous studies or the nationalist presumption of local scholars. However, preoccupied as they are with identifying the correct Albanian old language or old history, for instance, they end up with a search for origins not unlike old generation research, rather than approaching them in terms of dynamic process between different groups sharing a common territory and a common history. More seriously, a related problem may be a definite moral ideological position and orientation on Albanian rustic patriarchy, which is being developed by contemporary German and Austrian historical scholars, especially at the University of Vienna and Graz. Some of them still reproduce old patterns of cultural particularism and cultural determinism, as they seem to not have been totally liberated from the old culturalist legacy of the Kulturhistorische tradition, from which official communist and nationalist scholarship seem to have emerged in Albania and in the Balkans. Well served in using empiricist evidence from a wide range of sources, they endlessly try to divide and typify cultural areas in Europe and in the Balkans, reminiscent of the old anthropogeographical Kulturkreislehre. Arguably, this kind of evidence becomes flawed in support of a position that assumes, for instance, a so-called Balkan family pattern, which is supposed to be characterized exclusively by a distinctive patriarchal cultural background, where institutional factors and ideological elaboration have got muddled in what is blatantly reified as Balkan patriarchy. And you recognize your mentor. Not surprisingly, therefore, that all this becomes good to characterize these people as caught up into their agnatic dyadic relationship or their supposed tribal law, not only complex family structure and especially many children, but also predatory warfare, blood feud, honor killings, birth customs, ancestor worship, cradle betrothal, bride purchase, and many, many other savage customs of the like. As I showed elsewhere in a systematic critical analysis confronting demographic data, historical sources, and ethnographic evidence in connection with the average age at marriage and the total fertility rate in Albania, it seems that the cultural myths and ideology associated with patrilineality are conflated with the actual practice of patriarchy, and it is too easily assumed that the patriarchal language and discourse that symbolically support patrilineality result uniformly in outcomes and practices that are simply patriarchal. Thus, in such a way, a purely ideological dimension is commonly obscured. In particular, the myth of many children with the so-called patriarchal Albanian family is commonly constructed and conveyed in academic writings, the press and stereotyped opinion, not only German-speaking, but invalidated if we take what is put forward as empirical evidence to be nothing else but a strong cultural activism. Actually, Albanian family is confronted since a long time with particularly low fertility rate and with a relatively high average age at marriage for women, while the myth of the great patrilineal family with many children is obviously an ideological construction where women are strongly subjugated to the reproduction of the social group. Seriously, after the writing culture debate and the declaration of war against reification and essentialism, I really don't know what to do with the German-speaking tradition scholarship.